I like to have this gamer mindset. And to me, that just means maximizing the things I'm good at, minimizing the things I suck at. And for me, it's like whenever I do something, I just go all in. And so it's less about de risking. I think it's more about expanding my options and just taking decisions and just going with it. It's kind of like dropping out of school. I didn't think too much about it. It was just a decision Nathaniel and I made, and we just never looked back. And so I think it just happened that way that all these things led to de-risking each decision.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, sci-fi nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Mondays for your weekly tech news debate with Shi & Co., managing partner of Hustle Fund. Wednesdays for interviews of regional changemakers covering both the highs and lows of leadership. Fridays for personal diary insights and listener questions and answers. Join our movement of over 12,000 members for transcripts, analysis, and community at www.bravesea.com. Do you manage your own IT for distributed teams in Asia? You know how painful it is. Asavol helps your in-house team by taking tough tasks off their hands and giving them the tools to manage IT effectively. Get help across 8 countries in Asia Pacific, which includes onboarding, procurement, device management, real-time IT support, offboarding, and more. Gain full control of all your IT infrastructure in one place with our state-of-the-art platform. Check out Asavol, ESEVEL.com, and get a demo today. Use our referral code BRAVE for 3 months free. Terms and conditions apply. Hey Robert, really excited to have you on the show. I still remember us discussing your decision to drop out and build a startup, and it's been incredible to watch your journey and growth so far. So I'd love for you to introduce yourself real quick.
Thank you. And Jeremy, it's been awesome to be invited onto the podcast. Really excited to be here. Quick intro on me. I'm a Vietnamese American. Right now, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Nook. We're a jobs platform, and I connect construction workers with contractors, employers in Vietnam.
Amazing. So how did you first get into tech? Because you work at Microsoft, you work at Google's Moonshot factory, but how did you say, like, I want to work in the tech industry?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Honestly, growing up, I didn't have a clear idea of what I wanted to do. I grew up with a single mom, and she was raising me and my little sister, did not have a lot of opportunities. A fun fact is that I was in ESL, even though I was born in the US, I'm an American, but I never really had the opportunities to figure out what was possible. And so in college, I just did a little bit of everything. I did an internship every semester, every summer, and crammed in as much as I could do, from consulting to banking to just trying things out. Even med school was in the question because that's what my parents secretly wanted me to do. And I think the way I made my path to tech was because of the consulting project I had. At that time, I had Facebook and Twitter as my client over the summer for one of my internships, and Symantec and other cybersecurity companies as my second internship. Realized it was super cool to get that experience working at a client site. But as I was graduating, I realized, wait, wouldn't it be even cooler to just work at a big tech company? And as a lifelong gamer, I had grown up playing Dance Dance Revolution and Magic and StarCraft. I figured there was no better place to be than in a video game company. And so I joined Microsoft in a finance rotational program. It gave me a chance to kind of get leadership roles across many different departments. But the first rotation I was in, I was focused on this consumer group, specifically Xbox. And so it's so cool to work on that Xbox One launch, so cool to get into tech, where I felt like at least the narrative at that time was that tech was changing the world. And I wanted to be a part of that.
And what's interesting is that you start out in finance and you transition into eventually joining Google and transitioning into business intelligence and various projects.
Mhm.
So, could you share a little bit more about how that transition happened? Like you said, I've learned something at Microsoft. I would like to go to Google, but I also like to transition my role. So, could you share a little bit more about that? I think evolution and maturation about how and what role you wanted to play within that time frame.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I felt like that first role I had out of college was this boot camp. I got to see a little bit of everything. Every 6 months, it would move us into a new role. And even though it was like a finance rotational program, we got to see like a ton of stuff on going through how do we launch products? How do we think about gaining metrics? Then I went into a role that worked really closely with our investor relations team. How do we think about launching out 10Qs and 10Ks? And then I went into a corporate strategy role, a role focused on M&A, thinking about our Nokia acquisition. And then, like, at the very end of it, I even got a chance to move out to China. I moved to Beijing and learned Mandarin, was able to get really operational with the sales team in there. And that was kind of my first exposure working internationally. So as I started thinking, like, what do I do after those first 2 years? I realized there's so many different teams I could join. But what really excited me at that time was our wearables team. They were doing these head-mounted devices called the HoloLens. There was the Microsoft Band, which is a wrist-worn wearable. And I wanted to get as deep as I could into this vision of the future. I guess nowadays we would call it the metaverse. But that wasn't where I wanted to stop. After 4 years and after all my ESOP had fully vested, I was like, okay, well, I need to move down to the heart of Silicon Valley. And that was when I was like, okay, playing around, trying to figure out what to do. And a role on the Google corporate strategy capital allocation team opened up. Super small team on just alphabet wide projects, looking and thinking through what are all the different product areas that Google has, thinking through capital allocation decisions. And it just sounded like a blast. It was the CFO's SWAT team. And in that like 1 year on the team, I got to see so much of how executives think about big product areas. How do they understand what drives the P&L? What's the future of this company? But I also realized that these tech companies have very different perspectives in what they care about. I felt like at Microsoft, at the end of the day, it was at its core a enterprise sales company. And that was in the DNA of how Microsoft worked. Everything was driven through this like giant MYR, like mid-year review process. How do we think about growing each of the geos that we had, each of the different product lines? Like it was this amazing beast. At Google, we didn't have that same discipline that Ruth, our CFO at that time, or still is, trying to bring into Alphabet. And instead, I felt like the business teams had less of a priority. And so about a year in, I started learning how to go into the data engineering field. And I made my transition over to X, specifically on Project Lantern, their cybersecurity project. And I got really deep into the data engineering side while helping all the different business partners. It was a small 50-person startup, if you will. And after my time there, I was like, well, I want to get even deeper. I want to see what I could do with this data. And so I moved over to our self-driving car project as a product analyst working in data science. And that was super fun too. But I took on still a lot of business responsibilities because that was my background. I think my journey from starting off on very businessy stuff to more technical, more engineering roles has given me a lot of perspectives in how to build products and how to manage P&Ls, but also to think really deeply about like what is the culture and DNA I want to build into my company.
So, what did you learn at Google Moonshots, right? What was it like? Because I think everybody thinks about it as this like crazy lab or it's like a villain's lair, you know, or the folks that look like it's a financial black hole, a waste of money, I think, from the public market's perspective. So, what was it like from your perspective from the inside?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because there's a little bit of all of that. In some ways, yeah, it could be a financial black hole because you're looking at such long time horizons. I think it goes back to the culture of these companies. I like to joke that at Microsoft, the way that Amy Hood had built out Microsoft is that it's very investor focused. We're always thinking about how do we have these amazing metrics for investors. How do we think about share buybacks or dividends? At Google, it was the opposite. There is not a lot of emphasis on investors. It was much more of an emphasis on the employees. And so I felt like the Moonshot Lab was an awesome place to be an employee because you got to unleash your creativity, and we were changing the world. We're taking on audacious goals that would, if it paid off, would really start to change the way that we as a humanity interacted with one another, how we advance in society and solve these big, hairy problems. What I felt like the reality of it, though, was that we would get lost in that. And a part of my realization over working on 2 different projects, spending 3 years there, was that these time horizons were so long that I wanted to work on something much more tangible, much more here in the now. And that eventually led me to start thinking about, well, maybe I could go back to Vietnam, a place where my parents fled as refugees, to build something of my own.
So there you are thinking about this, and then you decide to go for a Harvard MBA. So how does that time synchronize from your perspective? Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit odd from the outside, but my thought process at that time was, well, I don't feel well equipped. I don't know what I'm doing. To be a founder, I need to have all these different things. And with the COVID-19 pandemic coming online, that uncertainty led me to take that additional step of applying for an MBA program. And so I made the application last minute, ended up getting in with the goal of building a startup in Vietnam. For me, it's been a long journey. And my cousins over here in Vietnam will always tell you, like, Robert, he's been telling us that he'll come back to Vietnam. We still haven't seen him. When I actually decided to leave school to build Nook, they're like, oh my God, I can't believe this is actually happening at last. And so for me, going to business school was a way for me to find community, like-minded folks, but also to build up insurance for myself. This feeling of like, if this goes wrong, maybe I have this additional backup. Looking back, though, I feel like it was an unnecessary step. But I think that the community that I've built there is super powerful and has given me confidence, which without, maybe I wouldn't be where I am today.
Let's double click a little bit on that, right? Because I think for most folks, going to Harvard for MBA is like a golden ticket, right? To Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, right? So there you are, you're doing a Harvard MBA, and then you choose to drop out, right? After a year. And I remember us discussing that. My advice was generally, if you can stick it out one more year, just do it and then start a startup. Or to be more precise, do what I did, which was really not focus on the second year of school and just focusing on startup full time and be a part-time student and just get it done. And you decided otherwise, right? So I'm just kind of curious for folks, right? Because they're going to be curious, right? Like you chose to drop out of the West Point of capitalism, right? The number one business school in the world, right? So kind of walk us through a little bit about, I think, that process of how you made a decision and why you made a decision.
Yeah, it's a funny question because to me, when I was applying to business school, my coworkers, my manager, they were like, Robert, what are you doing? You're wasting your time with an MBA. If you want to go build something, just start building it. And when I actually got to business school, I had came in with the mindset of like, well, maybe this is valuable, maybe it's not. It's a reversible decision, but one that I wanted to try out and see what the community was like. When I was going through the experience, I realized that it's pretty freaking awesome. I love it. It was just a blast to meet super smart, interesting folks all the time. And I was always talking about Vietnam. I was always talking about building a startup, and that attracted folks to me that wanted to do something in Vietnam, that wanted to build a startup. That community is something that I think is priceless. The reason why I ended up dropping out, it was kind of unexpected. I started Nook with one of my section mates and another friend and decided to move to Vietnam in the middle of their military lockdown. We had a 3-week hotel quarantine and then a 1-week mandatory at home quarantine. And for me, people were like, well, why don't you just wait till after graduation to do that? Take another job or start it in the US. I couldn't wait at that point. I'd been talking about moving to Vietnam for so long that I needed to just go there and eat the banh mi and eat the pho and be a part of this life that I wanted so badly. I wanted to be able to move to Vietnam as quick as I could, despite your advice, many other folks' advice, to just finish the last year because I couldn't wait. The second part to this is that when I was there in quarantine with my co founder, Nathaniel, we realized that helping folks in Vietnam was really exciting. I'd always loved building community wherever I was. Like as a kid, I would organize these Magic the Gathering meetups in the small, tiny town I was a part of. In business school, I would bring people to play video games and even board games now in Vietnam. I felt the community in Vietnam was just amazing. People were so welcoming, and everyone is always hustling. They're always working not just one, but 2, 3 jobs, selling something on Shopee, trying to run a restaurant, a cafe on the side. And that energy, that excitement, I didn't get the same feeling while at HBS, but I also recognize it's a door that I can reopen later on. That's not to say that HBS was a terrible experience. It was an amazing experience, but that 3 months in Vietnam showed me that, like, wow, I need to do this right now. And I would regret it more if I went back to school in that moment.
Was the decision hard? Was it a spur of the moment thing? Was it considered? Was it intuitive? How did you approach that decision?
Honestly, it was spur of the moment. Like at the end of the first year, I was convinced I'm just gonna do a idea, copy something that was working in the US, apply to Vietnam, get my reps in, learn, and do the startup after I graduate. At the end of the summer, I realized that I loved working. It was just so much fun building something that people would use, that people would have a benefit, and connecting people together. It was just this amazing feeling of getting back into making something people wanted instead of going through classes and doing stuff that at times I know is very important, but also it was hard to connect in the moment. So for me, it was a spur of the moment when I remember distinctly Nathaniel and I were swimming around in a pool. We had actually been kicked out of Vietnam. We were in Thailand, hoping to go to Israel Trek, which of course got canceled that year. And when we were thinking like, oh, so we have a week now extra. Should we keep on working on the startup or should we go back to Boston and get ready? We decided like, no, let's just keep working on it. Little did we know, though, we'd be stuck in Thailand for 4 more months, but that's another story.
So I think what is interesting is that you had this idea and you decided to build in construction tech, right?
Mhm.
And obviously you've gone through some product market fit search, some iteration on it. Could you share a little bit more about that journey, about how you decided to build this company, right? Because it's one thing to say, I want to come back to Vietnam and
Mhm.
build something or be part of something. But it's another thing to be like, okay, it's a new market to me, right? And it's a new vertical, right? You haven't been part of construction tech as part of your prior history. So how is it that you landed on this problem and product market fit?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it originally started, like I mentioned, as a copycat idea, something that I saw work out really well in the US, and I could just paste into Vietnam. I quickly realized that was not going to work. And I'm ashamed, but it took me almost 11 months before it sunk in. I've now pivoted away from the original construction tech idea, making home renovations simple. Instead, I connect construction workers with employers. And the reason why we landed on this idea is because my third co founder is my family member, cousin, and she has never left Vietnam outside of going to vacation. And for her, she noticed that the reason why the original idea failed was that people would use their 3D design tool, create this amazing home layout, and they would just repost it into a bunch of Facebook groups. And in these Facebook groups, people would say, hey, I need 5 construction workers to do it for $17 a day per person. And I need it now. Here's my phone number. Call me. At first, I was upset. I was like, hey, guys, they're stealing our IP. They're using this amazing design tool that we put together. And my cousin was like, well, they're always going to do this. Like, Robert, I wanted to tell you earlier, but we were just starting out. We weren't sure exactly how this was going to work, and I trusted you. Then I realized, one, there's a huge cultural difference in how we work in Vietnam and in the US. But two, I was like, oh, wow, I just learned something. And it's that in Vietnam, Facebook groups, Zalo groups, they kind of run a lot of the economy in Vietnam. If you want to go find a house, you're going to go look for that apartment in a Facebook group. You're going to contact a bunch of agents on Zalo. We discovered the current idea by looking into all these different Facebook groups that people reposted our designs in and seeing how many people were going through the same process every day, posting a job on a Facebook group, commenting, looking for that job, and the painful process of responding to all those different messages. We interviewed countless contractors, employers, and workers. And so for us, I thought about the things that I really cared about. I'd always cared about building community. And here was my chance to help this community get better access to jobs, have a community that they can trust instead of potentially fake spam users that were pushing an agenda. And three, providing like a level up opportunity, to use my gaming metaphor, to get new skills and get to the next level. Could we look at how dangerous it was to be a construction worker in Vietnam and how there's no protection at all for these workers? For example, I can go on and on, but maybe I'll pause there, Jeremy.
I mean, what did you learn from product market fit iteration from your perspective from these transitions?
Yeah, so the first idea, I think, had a lot of great product market fit. People were excited to use the design tool, but it was a mismatch because when I actually started talking to the users, they were like, you want me to use a lighter equipped iPhone or iPad to scan my room? The people with money, they're like, no, I want you to do it for me. And the people at the low end didn't have those high-tech sensors. With this new idea, I think what was really encouraging for us was that we just started off with a quick pilot. How about we build our own Facebook group, our own Zalo group? Let's see what would happen if we did that. And we had 50,000 community members within the first 6 weeks. People were excited to join as long as we were posting trusted, valuable content. And the product market fit part, as a early pre-seed stage company, I wouldn't say we have it just yet now, but we're seeing early signs of it, as in the last 6 months, we've been seeing tons and tons of workers sign up for our platform. They're asking us every single day, like, hey, have you found a new opening for us? Hey, can you help me solve this problem? And realizing that a lot of these workers just didn't get paid on time, and there's no one looking out for them, no one reading through some of these labor contracts, nor anyone speaking up if they got hurt. We're like, wow, I want to do this regardless if there's product market fit. These people need our help.
And what are some myths or misconceptions about this labor marketplace and matching platform that you've built?
Yeah, I think a lot of the misconceptions here is that construction is this big machine that is already well ran because it's been around for so long, and technology doesn't have a place to help out. What I'm seeing is that there's tons of ways that technology can help, not just with the early things that we're working on now, but even with a lot of the computer vision stuff that I'd worked on prior, and thinking through, how do I assess quality of construction workers? At the very high end and the very large contracting firms, they want to not pay these workers by day, they want to pay by quantity. How many square meters can you do? And so, yes, you can go ahead with the very manual, let me see you work for 2 hours and I'll tell you how much I'll pay you. Instead, we can rate them ahead of time with computer vision apps. Just use a bunch of different sensors to figure out how exactly are they performing. Can we use different AIs to help coach them or interview them? You can go on, find most popular Hugging Face models for voice to text, use it with any of these new AI models from OpenAI or Anthropic, and you can have a pretty good sense of how well these workers are performing because they'll know for setting the paint on the wall, you need to wait a certain amount of time. In order to do this, you need to do that. And being able to build trust with these workers is the most important part. And so, even though technology is this very old, archaic industry, it's been around forever, I think of it as this ripe opportunity to help build up emerging markets, literally building it up. And for me, I see this jobs platform focusing on construction as just a starting point. I want to hit other industries over time, but construction is the largest part of what's growing and building this economy, and that's what I want to focus in on.
What's interesting, of course, for labor marketplaces, obviously, is like the two sides of it, right? So yours, for example, be construction firms, and other one be construction workers, right? And like you said, there's a very strong blue collar orientation, obviously. So, for example, we talk about contracts that are badly written or perhaps not understood. So that a lot of work goes there. How do
Mm-hmm.
you think about the economics of that transition? Do you see that monetizing from the employee side? Do you see that value coming from the construction companies? How does that play out from your perspective?
Yeah, definitely. For Nook, the way we see it is that, and we started off with just focusing on the individual freelance workers. There's roughly 4.5 to 5 million workers in Vietnam, and the majority of them only work part time. They can't find consistent, stable jobs. So these are more gig workers than they are true employees. The economics of it is, of course, going to be borne by the employer, the contractor. But I'm actually seeing other ways that we could potentially monetize. Like, for example, going back to the safety point, they don't have the proper training upfront, which I think that a lot of these construction companies would be excited to see workers knowing what are the right regulations, policies ahead of time, but also having the right escalation points while they're on the project. And after the project, if there were any issues during construction, we could sell micro insurances that would help the workers or the contractors. And so to start off with a 6-month pivot in this new direction, we'll focus on the straightforward thing, monetize upfront. Instead of charging 10% to source a gig worker, we'll just charge 5%. Over time, I see us building out these tools that would help the workers or the employer. And so that's micro insurances, just like what Grab or B does with their motorcycle drivers. Or we can help them build out HR accounting tools to track where their workers are. A lot of times they don't even know if these workers came to work because there's many sub layers within this. The large construction companies are subcontracting out many, many times. And so by simply creating a geo ring fence around the project site, I know if this phone has entered and left that perimeter.
So, there you are, obviously you're building and so on and so forth. And what's interesting is that you're a sea turtle, right, as you described, right? You're a Vietnamese American who's returned to Vietnam. Nick Nash at Asian Partners has written a whole report. I don't know, you saw those like 10 slides talking about Vietnamese sea turtles, Vietnamese Americans, and Vietnamese students returning to Southeast Asia and Vietnam. What's been some of that transition that you have, right? Because you had this childhood thesis, right, of returning back to Southeast Asia, and now you've done it, right? So what has been some of the learnings and changes or differences from what you expected initially?
Yep. I think I had always expected some cultural changes to happen from the US American workplace environment that I had been in. But I didn't think it'd be this severe. It was pretty drastic. For me, I saw that the employees here, the culture of how they work, is very, very hierarchical. When we speak in Vietnamese, we address each other with different titles. And I try to drop that. It's like, I don't need to be known as An Robert or An Yahao, my Vietnamese name. And the way that they engage is really kind of waiting to be asked something, prompted, before speaking up. So a big part of how I built Nook is just focusing on the right people to hire and ingraining the cultural values into each new team member so that as we grow, as we scale up, we're able to maintain that culture. An example would be speaking up. People in Vietnam, even though my cousin, I told her, hey, if there's a problem, if you think this is a bad idea, I need to know about this. Didn't tell me until after we decided to pivot towards the new direction. I trust her. She's super smart, incredible woman, boss lady. Still took a decent amount of time, but now she understands. Now she gets it. Other cultural differences is just how work gets done. The teams that you build out in Southeast Asia are just much, much bigger. A part of that is because of the cost of labor, but also the saying here that we have in Vietnam is it's run by rice, I guess. And so there's that human labor component until you get something up. And so we've been able to do that to kind of MVP test out this new idea and direction that we've been in, building out a Facebook group. Let's manually connect the workers. And now just this past month, we were able to launch a actual Android app that is converting those users from the Facebook groups solutions that we had before into our own proprietary solution. That's all to say that it's been a fun journey as I kind of rediscover my own heritage. And that was a big reason for me to want to return to Vietnam in the first place, is to be able to learn more about me and not just the life that my parents had described as refugees fleeing Vietnam, but seeing Vietnam as it is today. And that's been really exciting.
Could you share about a time that you personally have been brave?
Yeah, for me, I think that the time that I felt I was most brave was dropping out of HBS, coming to Vietnam, leaving Vietnam, and not really knowing what I would do next. The timing was a little bit interesting. So let me talk about that. When Nathaniel and I had decided to leave school, we were still in a military lockdown. We were hoping to go to Israel Trek from Vietnam, but it was blacklisted, so we had to get to Thailand first. When we were trying to go back to Vietnam, we realized there was no visa, so we were waiting, living from hotel room to hotel room for 4 months. 2, we didn't know anyone. It was a random country that we didn't think we would be in. And Thailand wasn't what it is now. It had a curfew at 9 p.m. And I think what was tough was that we just didn't have our support network. We didn't know people in Thailand, and we didn't know how long we would be there, so we didn't invest in those relationships. What was so interesting about that time frame was that it was through the daily micro interactions with Nathaniel that I was like, wow, I found a co-founder that I fully trust. We had been sharing a bed for almost 5 months at that time, 8 months. And for us to go through that experience, to realize, wait, all my section mates and HBS friends were constantly messaging me like, hey, how are you guys doing over there? Like, I'm excited to hear about Nook. My friends from before business school were reaching out, and even my old boss came in as an investor into Nook, gave us the confidence that even though we hadn't really secured any funding yet, YC came in a little bit later on, that we were working in the right direction and that no matter what, we always had the community behind us. And so that was the thing that I learned going through that experience of leaving school to a place where we were eating away at our savings, didn't know anyone, and didn't know when we would actually be able to go into Vietnam to do the thing we wanted to do, which was to work directly with customers to practice the Vietnamese that we were studying online every day.
You know, what's interesting, of course, is that during this time, you've also, like you said, went into Y Combinator, which is, I think, another dream for many folks. I guess the Harvard of startups as well. And what was that experience like from your perspective? Because that's actually a pivotal moment of like what you shared in that journey, right? It was like a turning point in that community. So could you share a little bit about what it meant? Because I think historically, Y Combinator also has not had too many Southeast Asia companies represented in their cohorts as well.
Yeah, Y Combinator was amazing. I love it because of the community and the people. It's similar to like HBS, as you mentioned, but I think the difference is that as I was going through business school, the classes, the lessons that I took away, I was like, yeah, that's so cool. And it's awesome hearing the protagonists come in and talk about that experience, but it's not something that I would use today. At YC, the boot camp part of it, I think, is often overlooked. People just talk about like, oh, the demo day dynamics, you're gonna get all these investors, like it's awesome just being in there. But the reality of it is that the boot camp to me was one of the most unique parts because, and totally worth staying up to 5 a.m. in Vietnam time to watch and understand, is because that the advice was so relevant. Henrique from Brex, for example, if he was telling me about this and I wasn't building a startup on week 4 of my startup journey, I wouldn't understand. Oh, yeah, that's how you build an MVP. That's how you think about, well, if I can't get a license to do credit cards for startups, then I'll try out debit cards. And if that doesn't work, then I'll try out gift cards. And it's just the moments in time that feel really, really special, that when these different founders come in and talk to us, it's like, wow, yeah, that's really impactful. They understand where we are right now. And it's something that I wouldn't have been able to understand if I wasn't going through that journey at that point in time. So the YC experience overall was amazing. And the community of folks that I've been able to meet, to get to know, and now spam WhatsApp messages asking how many holidays days are you giving them in Vietnam? What does your labor contract look like? Like, these are all little things that really help when I'm trying to get very, very operational.
The interesting phrase you use multiple times is that you've often used these programs as a way to de-risk, right? A certain process, right? So you said MBA, you want to try it out as a way to de-risk that process. And then you also talk about YC as an interesting inflection point of that risk curve / money running out, etc. So do you have a philosophy on like one-way decisions and reversible decisions around risk and de-risking?
Yeah. I mean, I think Jeff Bezos has a lot of things around two-way doors and minimizing regret. I think that's great. The way that I've always looked at it is that as a gamer, I like to have this gamer mindset. And to me, that just means maximizing the things I'm good at, minimizing the things I suck at. Like in RuneScape, I would go out on my offense because that's how you won the PvP. And for me, it's like whenever I do something, I just go all in. And so it's less about de-risking. I think it's more about expanding my options and just taking decisions and just going with it. It's kind of like dropping out of school. I didn't think too much about it. It was just a decision Nathaniel and I made, and we just never looked back. And so I think it just happened that way, that all these things led to de-risking each decision. But I think at that time, it was just the best decision that I saw.
Amazing. On that note, I'd love to kind of like paraphrase the 3 big things that I got from this conversation. The first, of course, is thank you so much for sharing about how you grew up with a single mother to eventually join big technology with Microsoft and eventually Google Moonshots. And you learned a lot from the experience about the investor framing versus a long-term future framing, to eventually deciding that you wanted to build something of your own and return to Vietnam, and how you eventually navigated your own way back to becoming a founder in Vietnam as a Vietnamese American. And I thought this was a tremendous journey where you also got to share a little bit about some of the dynamics and career decisions and the way that you thought about risk and maximizing your strengths and minimizing your weaknesses in order to make that decision. The second, of course, is I really appreciate you sharing about your experience dropping out of Harvard and how you thought about it and how you approached it during the time of the pandemic, as well as how you saw that in the context of founding your own company. I also found it was interesting to talk about how you also at that time going through your own cultural transition as a sea turtle, really understanding, for example, the differences in communication patterns and how work is done due to hierarchy versus a non-hierarchical approach that you have. And also how you see that there are larger teams on average for the same stage due to the lower cost of labor and the way of work as in Vietnam. And also how you really appreciated rediscovering your own cultural heritage. Lastly, I really appreciated you sharing about how you approached the iteration of the product market fit. I think it was interesting for you to share so openly about how you thought about localizing a US-based idea, right, for home renovations. And I thought there was some really interesting anecdotes about, for example, upper class wanting the scanning to be done for them and the middle class not having the mobile hardware needed to make it happen. And the customers who did buy you ended up disintermediating you to engage your own construction workers, right? I thought that was a I think a beautifully honest story and parable, honestly, of how localization can go wrong. But I thought it was interesting to see how you took user feedback and the feedback from your own cousin about how to pivot and build a construction labor marketplace that has turned out to have much more natural traction and excitement from both the construction agencies and companies, but also from the construction workers themselves. So thank you so much for coming on the Brave Show.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. It was amazing being on the podcast, and stay brave.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.